Translucent scrim light is a beautiful light that works best on a blue sunny day, just the days we used to dread. It involves hard sunlight passing through a white sheet of material, producing a clean white soft light when the subject is close to it.
It takes the fear out of shooting in sunlight. Just place it close to the subject, in between the sun and the subject. This should make it clear which is best. I won't be getting too technical with terms, but sometimes it helps to speak the same language. These are the various aspects of lighting contrast. Sunlight images have a wide range of tones, from deep shadow to bright specular highlights. That makes it hard for cameras to record that wide range. Scrimmed images have a more compressed range of tones. This makes them easier to capture and to print with detail in the important areas, like skin tones. This was done in mid-morning. A scrim can extend your shooting times. If you need to work when it's sunny, you'll need to be able to control sunlight. A PVC frame scrim works very well with a light stand. This is obviously direct sunlight and the scrimmed shot. And with an accent reflector. The neat thing about quality lighting is that it's timeless. I did this in 2002. This old Larson scrim can be mounted to a light stand. Later in the day, we need to keep the scrim higher for the higher sunlight. But then the person needs to tilt their head sideways for proper facial lighting. If you're shooting a waist-up photo, you can use a twist-open type of scrim. This image is properly exposed. There's detail in the highlights and shadows, but the contrast isn't pleasing or flattering. We either need to raise the shadow density on the subject or reduce the highlight density on the subject. So the way to handle that is to reduce the strength of the light. Doing this with a scrim gives us a better portrait light than filling in the hard shadows with a fill reflector or even flash. In the before image on the left, we can see that the lighting contrast was a problem. The image on the right shows that dropping a scrim between the sun and the subject reduces that contrast. I let the camera set the exposure based on the subject. Because a scrim also reduces light intensity, the shutter stays open longer and the background appears lighter. A large rectangular scrim is a better tool than the previous small scrim because it offers more options. I can place it on the ground or on a light stand and position it horizontally so the majority of the scrim is in front of the subject, giving more frontal light. In this example, I kept the exposure constant for the shadow side of the face for the before and after shots.
As you can see, whether we set our exposure on the highlight or the shadow side of the face, hard sunlight causes too much contrast. We need to bring that contrast into a narrower range. A scrim is a great tool to accomplish that. So a scrim doesn't lighten the background, it darkens the foreground.
An overhead diagram shows how the scrim softens the sun's light. Although the sun is large, it's so far away that it becomes a small point source, making hard shadows and specular light. Because the scrim is close and large relative to the subject, it produces softer light.
The next 3 images will show why we place the scrim as far forward as possible. We'll start by showing the lighting setup with the subject correctly placed. You'll see that the scrim is horizontal. I use it that way if I don't have a lot of vertical area that I need to show. If the scrim is too far back, the subject would be lit by too much light coming from behind and not enough in front.
By moving the scrim forward, the subject is illuminated by more of the bright scrim light in front, resulting in much more pleasing facial lighting. Because a scrim softens the light, it smoothens the appearance of skin when compared to hard light. I'll show the hard truth about that in the next few examples. Hard sunlight from the side accentuates rough skin. Soft light masks those imperfections because it's larger and fills in those shadows. This rather brutal close-up of the previous image shows that we'd have to spend more time on retouching than we would on this one. Neither image has been retouched.
How close should a scrim be to the subject? When a scrim is far away, it becomes a gobo, only blocking sunlight. The light that passes through a scrim gets scattered in all directions, so little of it reaches the subject. By bringing the scrim as close as possible without seeing it in the camera, we get its maximum light on the subject.
The following 4 photographs will demonstrate the effect called key shifting. Because the girl is wearing a white dress, I want the background to be very light, to be in the same key.
With the scrim relatively far away from the subject, it not only subtracts much of the sunlight, but because of the inverse square law, not much of that scrim's diffused light reaches her. So she's in deep shade. Then the camera readjusts for that, making the shutter stay open longer, rendering a brighter background. By the way, if it's too windy to put the scrim on a light stand and you have no assistant, you can set your camera to self-timer and hold the scrim yourself.
It looks like it got brighter, right? Actually, it stayed the same. When we readjusted the camera for the subject's lower exposure in partial shade, the background that is still in full sunlight is rendered lighter. And finally, a high-key vignette in Photoshop completes the look I envisioned when I photographed it.
Sometimes I need to resort to a Photoshop cut and paste technique to correct the lighting problem. The highlight lighting on this image is too strong, but I used this exposure for the overall view. Then I had his dad hold a small scrim in the path of the sunlight. I used this image of his face. Finally, I blended the best of the two together for this result.
When an assistant is holding a scrim, be sure that they don't block the sun hitting the scrim. You want all of that diffused light. We're going to be working in the garage by the back wall, and I wanted to make a high-key image. I set up the reflector outside to send light into the scrim, but also to the wall on the left of the scrim.
The same light that hits the wall also passes through the scrim, but a scrim reduces the light. That means the wall will be receiving more light than the subject.
This overhead diagram illustrates the setup.
Without the scrim and raw light hitting the wall behind her goes a little bit muddy. It's not a bad thing, but it just wasn't the effect that I was after. With the scrim and the reflected raw light on the wall, I achieved the high-key look that I was looking for. A top view diagram shows the setup for the portrait example that will follow. I've placed a translucent scrim and a black gobo next to the subject. When raw sunlight hits the white translucent panel, soft light passes through it and illuminates the face. Because the scrim is in front of the subject, its light reaches the far side of the face as well. The black gobo blocks light that would come from behind the subject if it were a translucent scrim. The scrim becomes a big fudge factor for the sun position. The sun could be behind, in front, above, or below the subject's face. We'll light the front of the subject's face by placing a translucent scrim in front and block the sun's light behind her with an opaque gobo. And this is the view from the other side. Without using that black gobo and just using the white scrim, we can get this problem. The light is too far behind her. See the contrast on her face? But using a black gobo and the white one farther in front gives us better facial lighting.
A senior girl's mom wanted us to use a swing in the front yard because the senior swung on it when she was a little kid, but it was in low, direct sunlight. So this is an overhead diagram of the lighting that I had to use. I placed a black gobo to block the sunlight on her, and two scrims in front of her to create a long source of frontal light. This is what the senior saw. My camera position was near the driveway. I used a 200mm lens at f2, but with a 1.4 teleconverter, so it ends up to be a 280mm lens at f4. That got me the high key, soft light, and shallow depth of field that I was looking for.